Hi, Merav. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Lynn.
So, I wonder if you could introduce yourself, tell our audience a little bit about who you are.
Well, thank you. I am primarily an author and a mama and a speaker. I've written quite a few books, and some of them fiction, some of them nonfiction. In addition, over the last few years, I don't want to say a ghostwriter because it's really much more magical than that. I like to call myself a book wizard and have written books for a plethora of people, primarily very, very, very powerful and inspirational women.
Awesome. Awesome. And you're Israeli and living in Canada, is that right?
Correct. Born and raised in Israel by Israeli parents. I speak full Hebrew. And even though I left Israel when I was young enough, like a young child with my parents, to move to a few places, England and then Canada, I returned when I was 18 to do, in lieu of my military service, I did a volunteer um, contract that worked very closely with the military, though I didn't do the actual military contract. And then came back to Canada after that and decided that I would have one foot in Canada and one foot in Israel for the next, you know, basically 30 years
Awesome.
now by working for the major airline in Canada and being able to go back to Israel very often.
That's
And it was basically for many years commuted to Israel
that's
and came back to Canada. So I have a wealth of Israeli knowledge and friends and family. And, you know, I do feel like those are my roots and those are
yeah.
also my branches.
Yeah. And you said that part of your service was on the border with Egypt, right? Did you
Correct.
specifically say exactly what that was?
Yeah, so I was actually stationed after my training, my basic training. I was stationed actually at the Rafah crossing, which is the crossing. The crossing itself still exists, though after Israel unilaterally pulled out of Gaza in 2006, that border has no Israeli presence there anymore.
Mhm.
Uh, it is only the border between Gaza and Egypt.
Okay.
It's the crossing, it's the gated area, the sort of approval of getting, much like if you cross any border, be it U.S. into Mexico, U.S. into Canada, there's a border guard.
Sure.
Of course, we can't imagine how that looks because, after all, U.S. and Canada has a friendly border.
Yes.
U.S. and Mexico less so,
Yeah.
but you can imagine if, when there was talk of like building the wall between U.S. and Mexico, the border along Gaza to Egypt is a militarized zone. It's a wall and it has fences,
Okay.
much like on the other side of the border, the Erez crossing, the Gaza border into Israel is very militarized. So there's a wall, there's an expanse that's a no man's zone, then there are electrified fences on both sides. So
Yeah.
that's where I was positioned in
Wow.
1994.
Okay. So, how have you been feeling over the past week since the attacks by terrorists in Israel, the massacre of so many people? How have you been feeling?
So when I awoke to the news on Saturday, uh, my first thought, of course, was to call my family. Now, I know that many people who practice Shabbat like diligently would not make those calls and wouldn't have access. I am not in that boat. I freely make calls on Saturday. I talked to my aunt and my family just to find out that they were okay. I can't imagine the people who had heard about what's going on, but then couldn't call their family or couldn't reach. But at least I had a surety that my family was okay.
Okay,
And
good.
as soon as I had a surety that my family was okay, I relaxed somewhat. But then something else came over, which was this, you talk about survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
This guilt of like, here I was doing something as unimportant as it was Thanksgiving in Canada. So I was cooking Thanksgiving supper
Yeah.
while my family is there, wondering if they're checking in with all the grandkids and the nieces and the nephews and making sure that everyone was okay. And by the grace of God, I had one niece who is a beautiful, bright light, and she had chosen to go to the Bruno Mars concert instead of going to the music festival.
Okay.
Like it was sort of a toss up between her. Now think of that. Just think of that. Like a 21-year-old girl, as we have 20 something year olds in our lives, and the decisions to go to Bruno Mars or a music festival sounds like
Yeah. Yeah.
the decisions that 20-year-olds are supposed to make.
Yeah.
And in choosing to go to Bruno Mars, she chose not to go to that music festival.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in doing that, be- because of that, she's alive. But many, many, many of her friends are not. And so here I am, Saturday, thankful. It was Thanksgiving, so I had give a lot of gratitude and thanks. And underneath that gratitude and thanks for not being there was a huge level of survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously shock. And I knew it wasn't healthy for me to watch these videos, but I couldn't not look. I couldn't not look.
And I mean, the repercussions too. I mean, it's devastating what happened. And then to see all these anti-Semitic protests and, you know, I don't know about you. I mean, I'm a pretty privileged American Jew. I have a pretty fortunate life, and I've been scared and sad, and I don't know. I mean, how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, I 100%. I seeing, as I mentioned to you in an earlier conversation, when the world woke up shocked to this thing called 9/11. What was more shocking than, when in the aftermath of it, in the days following it, people started to give justifications. Well, 9/11 happened because of America's military presence in Afghanistan, or because their interference with Iran, or the like, and all the political pundits started to make sense of it. But what didn't make sense, and what was the most hurtful and shocking to me, was that the day that 9/11 happened and we're watching on the TV this that happened, which was a pure act of terror, at the same time we were also watching videos of the people in different places in the world celebrating
Mhm.
9/11, literally on the back of trucks, honking and horning and fireworks, and celebrating.
Yeah.
And that was the bigger insult to the injury. And the same thing happened, is happening now,
Yes.
is in the aftermath of what happened Saturday. What we're seeing is videos of different places in the world justifying and celebrating uh, like these acts of heinous terror and massacre. And it's like, there is no justification. There is no justification for what happened. And again, as I mentioned to you earlier, that does not give a carte blanche for all of Israel politics, and that does not make it right, and that there has to be a solution that we look at, and that doesn't mean that there haven't been things that have been done in Israeli politics, including the current administration,
Oh, which is horrible.
like that are horrible.
Yeah.
But
But
there
that's
is
not
no
what's behind
justification
it.
for ISIS-style heinous, brutal massacres of citizens, of of rape, of kidnapping, of infiltrating people's homes to burn them down, to kill them at point blank range. There's no, you just can't compare the two.
And they're different conversations. I mean, the political conversation has a time and a place. It's not now. It's we have to process it. And I can't help but wonder if, it's just human nature to want to find an explanation, because if we don't have one, then it's just pure evil exists. And how do we make sense of that? And so I know as we were talking, you know, I focus on writing and publishing and the power of the written word and the story to help us make sense of things. I know that's how I figure out what I believe or what I think about something, by writing and exploring and asking questions. And so I really want to focus on that, on what our responsibility or gift is as writers to use that platform in some way to bring understanding, healing in some small measure to other people. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I actually would love to speak about this. And it's something I didn't mention in our earlier conversation, but there was a book that truly inspired me. And I really would love to give this book a plug because I really believe that in this topic about writing, every writer should actually read this book.
Mm-hmm.
It is called, I should say, The Alphabet versus the Goddess.
Okay.
And it's written by a man called Leonard Shlain. Now, Leonard Shlain is no longer with us. He, at the in his life, was a surgeon, um, a surgeon who operated on brains, a neurosurgeon.
Mm-hmm.
And this, at least the way he writes it, the way he tells the story, is that one time in the operating room, in the operating theater, as he was working on the connection between the corpus callosum and connecting the parts of the brain, he suddenly was hit with this inspiration where um, when humanity went from uh, the storytelling tradition, the oral storytelling tradition, which was the domain of the woman, the domain of the matriarch, the domain of, as he calls it, the goddess, very boldly proclaiming this goddess culture. When we went into alphabetizing things, when we went into creating a system, uh, a pedagogy or a dogma where we now have legalities and laws and an alphabet,
Mm-hmm.
we enhanced the part of the brain that that celebrates
Mm-hmm.
that, like celebrates that there are legalities and laws and a very strong ethic for the rational. And what we did then is we weakened or we stopped enhancing the storytelling
Mm-hmm.
part of the brain.
Okay.
And as we know, as the centuries have passed and the millennia have passed, I mentioned to you earlier that even it is said in the Kabbalah that the Bible was written black fire on white fire. It's the ink on the paper is one half of the bird. It's one wing of the bird, but the bird can't fly without the white fire on black fire, the oral storytelling tradition and the rituals and the symbolism of each part of the story to be told as an oral tradition.
Mm.
And here we are so many millennia years later, as we know that there was a time that women couldn't write, we're not allowed to write, women were not allowed to study the alphabet, women didn't have that medium to be able to express.
Yeah.
And yet now we're living in a time that women are now storytelling using the written word, the alphabet.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, and so, how important it is to express that storytelling tradition into the written word and into amalgamating that alphabet and that goddess, the two halves of our brain, the two wings of the bird,
Yeah.
you know, returning to that storytelling, sitting around the campfire and explaining why these morals exist and these ethics exist. And yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that part inherent in what you're saying is the connection between people. Because to tell an oral story, there needs to be an audience, a listener. And so you have to be connecting human to human in order to have that transmission and transformation. And I know this is a
100%.
huge part of Israeli culture too.
When I was working at the Rafah crossing, there was actually, as I mentioned, just try to visualize. There's actually the border checkpoint, and then there's a long stretch of area where there is a no-go zone that is fenced and fenced. But there were groups of peacekeeper groups, Amnesty International, the UN peacekeepers, that were standing there to ensure that they're watching at all times, like the international bodies, right? Like the International Watch. But more effective than the people who were standing there with their clipboards were actually the small volunteer organizations. And there's one that comes to mind. They were called the Three Mothers.
Mm.
And they made a a very distinct point of bringing at every time that they would stand there, that they would have a shift during the day, that they would have a woman of Jewish background, a woman of Muslim background, and a woman of Christian background standing there, the three mothers, to represent. And as any time that there was an incursion or something that they could see that went against the moral fiber, they would, from the fenced area, they would scream things out to, whether it be the soldier, whether it be the international body that may be there, an international army member, or the Muslim, uh, Palestinian or Egyptian trying to come through the border. Whenever they would see that there would be a fight breaking out, they would scream out, we are not dogs. You watch your, you weren't raised like that. You were, and they were more effective. These three mothers were more effective because these, let's let's call it what it was. I mean, these are 18-year-old kids.
Yeah.
18-year-old kids, mostly boys, because it was combat. We were like they're soldiered up, and like 19-year-old, 18, 19, 20-year-old, 21-year-old kids on all sides.
Yeah.
And so having these mothers standing there saying to them, like, I'm watching you.
Yes.
Like, you don't do that. You don't do that on my watch, was more effective, than any international body could be.
I mean, I think that inherent in that is the notion of seeing each other as human, and
Yeah.
large scale, even small scale murders and terror attacks like last weekend can only happen when you dehumanize someone and you don't
Yeah.
see them as a human being worthy of the same life, liberty, and opportunity as what you want and deserve. And and I love that to have three mothers there. It's just amazing. I wrote a book in 2013 called The Flavors of Faith, Holy Breads. And it's a nonfiction book about how every faith or community has a bread and there's
Mm.
recipes in it and stories and everything. But it's like if we all have this as part of our ritual or part of our identity, why are we fighting? Like, what do we have that's so different? And everybody's favorite chapter is the one where I went to a mosque here in Metro Detroit. And I saw a lot of the Arabic on the wall, and the root word was very similar to the Hebrew. And the women, middle aged women in the kitchen who were making this bread, which, by the way, for half a century had been supporting the mosque. Like they made $250,000 in sales every year from the bread. And so that kept the mosque
Wow.
afloat from these women, and these women were like my mother and my grandmother, and they were trying to feed me just like and it was just like it's everybody's favorite chapter because here I am, a Jewish woman, going into a mosque and feeling like, oh my gosh, this is a mirror image, and we're literally breaking bread.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know it's a lot to think about, and I'm grateful for this conversation, but I wonder if we could close. You wanted to share a little something from one of your books.
Yeah, well, apropos the power of storytelling, and this even that you shared with the breaking bread is exactly. I mean, it's not the bread that they were giving you; it was the stories behind the bread.
Yes.
Um, and so I wrote in my fictional story, because I write both fiction and nonfiction. But my first book was a fiction story, and it actually starts with chapter one starts with the purpose of a story, any story, is to give order to reality, not just chronological order, but also degrees of importance. But although they are never linear, by their very nature, stories must involve a beginning, a middle, and an end. Life rarely affords us such a clear view. We are not privy to the view of a new epoch while standing on the very precipice of a new era. We are unaware of the transformation that we are about to undergo until later, often much later. But a story is a seed that must be planted in order to grow. And I think we are now at the precipice of a new era. I think we've we're planting the seeds now.
I hope they're fruitful seeds. I really do. And I'm so grateful for this conversation, and I hope it's the first of many.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Merav.
Thanks, Lynn.